A Tuesday morning in late October, the glass doors of Ridgemont Federal swung open. Caleb Whitlock stepped inside, 6 feet, faded denim jacket streaked with pipe sealant. Beside him, 6-year-old Rosie, butterfly patches on her backpack, clutching her father's hand. Caleb set a manila envelope on the counter. "I need to wire $8 million. The teller blinked twice. From the corner office, Preston Hargrove rose, adjusted his cufflinks, crossed the lobby with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He laid a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "8 million? Maybe you mean 8,000? The lobby went silent. Caleb said nothing. He held Preston's gaze until the hand withdrew. 9:47 in the morning. The consultation room sat at the end of the hall, the air conditioning set too cold, a single window facing the parking lot, framed prints of mountain landscapes on the walls that no one had ever looked at twice. Preston settled behind the mahogany desk and crossed one ankle over the other knee. He studied Caleb the way a man studies a stain on an expensive rug. Caleb lowered Rosie into the chair beside him and opened the envelope. Notarized documents from a Houston estate attorney, a certified death certificate, a probate court order, a letter of instruction authorizing the transfer of $8,200,000 from the estate of Theodore Eugene Whitlock to the account of Caleb James Whitlock. Preston picked up the first page between 2 fingers as though it might be contagious. "And where exactly did this money come from, Mr. Whitlock?" Caleb explained. His grandfather, Theodore, had been a petroleum engineer in Galveston, Texas, 41 years on the Gulf Coast, mapping subsurface formations. He had lived in the same 1,200-square-foot house his entire adult life. He drove a 1987 Ford pickup older than Caleb himself. No one in Galveston had known Theodore Whitlock was wealthy because Theodore had not believed wealth was an interesting thing to know about a person. He had passed 6 months earlier, quietly, in his sleep, at 89. The will had been straightforward. Everything went to Caleb. Preston listened with the expression of a man humoring a child's story about a dragon in the backyard. He asked whether the documents had been notarized. Yes, every page. He asked why Caleb had chosen this branch rather than a Texas bank. Caleb lived in Ridgemont. This had been his bank for 11 years. He asked whether Caleb had considered that the documents might contain errors. Caleb said his grandfather's attorney had handled estates considerably larger than this one. There were no errors. Throughout the conversation, Rosie sat in the oversized leather chair, her legs dangling a full foot above the floor. She had found a blank deposit slip on the edge of Preston's desk. She pulled a crayon from her backpack and began to draw. She drew a small house with a triangular roof. Inside the house, she drew 2 figures, one tall, one short. There was no third figure. There had not been a third figure in any of Rosie's drawings for 3 years. Not since the morning at her mother Hannah's funeral, when she had asked from the front pew in a voice loud enough for the entire church to hear when Mommy was coming back from the long nap. Preston cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitlock, you understand. When someone walks in off the street with paperwork claiming $8 million, we have a responsibility to be thorough." He emphasized the words "off the street" as though Caleb had crawled through a window rather than walked through a door open to the public. "I'll need to run this through compliance. Standard procedure. In the meantime, what kind of work do you do, if you don't mind my asking?" "Plumber," Caleb said. Preston nodded slowly. His eyes drifted downward to Caleb's boots, to the grease stain on his right sleeve, to the calloused knuckles on the armrest. The nod said everything the mouth would not. Right. A plumber. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate smoothness, as though preparing to leave a stage. "Give me a few minutes. I need to verify a couple of things with my team." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Preston did not go to compliance. He did not consult risk management. He walked to the center of the lobby, where 2 senior tellers, Margaret and Kevin, stood behind the counter sorting deposit slips. He leaned against the counter and lowered his voice just enough to seem confidential, but not enough to avoid being overheard by the 4 employees within earshot. "Heads up. Guy in room B claims he's sitting on $8 million. Walked in wearing work boots and a jacket that smells like a hardware store." He let the image settle. "I've seen this before. Could be forged documents. Could be some kind of inheritance scam. Don't process anything until I give the word. Last thing we need is a scene." Margaret glanced toward the consultation room with a look that hovered between concern and obedience. Kevin pretended to count a stack of 20s he had already counted twice. A young teller named Dana Reeves looked up from her keyboard. 24 years old, 11 months at Ridgemont Federal. She had seen this pattern 4 times before. An elderly woman with a cashier's check. A young couple whose mortgage application had been questioned until they walked out. A veteran whose pension transfer had been delayed without cause. Each time, the same shape, suspicion first, service second, and only if the customer's appearance met Preston's unspoken standard. Dana said nothing. She wanted to, but Preston signed her performance reviews, and rent was due Friday. In the parking lot, a dark gray sedan idled. Behind the wheel, Sloane Beckett held a tablet on her lap. On the screen, a live feed from 4 interior cameras: lobby, teller counter, hallway, consultation room. Sloane was regional director for Ridgemont Federal's Southeastern Division. She had driven 2 hours from Charlotte that morning for an unannounced audit, triggered by a pattern of customer complaints escalating over 6 months. 7 formal complaints in the last quarter. 4 of them used the same phrase, "made to feel unwelcome." She watched Preston whisper at the counter. She watched the body language of the tellers, the discomfort, the averted eyes, Margaret's hand pausing mid-motion as though she wanted to object and did not know how. She watched Caleb sit calmly in the consultation room, his arm around the back of his daughter's chair, his face composed in the particular stillness of a man who had learned to absorb indignity without flinching. Sloane turned off the tablet, dropped it into her leather bag, and opened the car door. Inside the consultation room, Rosie tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why isn't that man being nice to you?" Caleb looked down at her. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the particular confusion of a child who has been taught that politeness is a rule and cannot understand why an adult would choose to break it. He smoothed the hair from her forehead and smiled the way he always smiled at her, as though she were the only thing in any room that mattered. "He's not being unkind, Rosie. He just doesn't know us yet." Rosie tilted her head the way she did when she was weighing an idea she was not entirely convinced by. Then she returned to her drawing. She added a yellow sun above the house and a row of red flowers along the bottom of the page. Caleb watched her, and for a moment, the 8 million, the paperwork, the man in the expensive suit, all of it receded like a tide pulling back from shore. In the parking lot, Sloane closed the door of the black Audi. As she walked toward the entrance, she looked through the lobby glass, saw the man in denim, and the child with the crayon, and something in her chest tightened. 20 minutes passed. Preston returned to the consultation room. He sat, adjusted his tie, and delivered his verdict with the rehearsed sympathy of a man who had disappointed people so many times the effort had become automatic. "Mr. Whitlock, I've consulted compliance. Unfortunately, we're going to need additional time to verify your documents. Standard procedure for a transaction of this magnitude could take 2 to 3 business days, possibly longer, depending on the queue." Caleb studied Preston's face the way he studied corroded pipe, looking for the weakness beneath the surface, the point where pressure would eventually cause a break. He had been reading people his entire adult life. He knew when a man was hiding behind procedure to avoid doing his job. "Is there someone with higher authority I can speak to?" Preston straightened in his chair. The suggestion that his authority was insufficient seemed to land like a slap delivered in slow motion. His jaw tightened. The smile hardened into a mask. "I am the highest authority in this branch, Mr. Whitlock." He paused, then added the word with deliberate, theatrical precision. "Sir." The word hung in the room like a wrong note, held too long. Caleb recognized it immediately, the same hollow, courtesy from the lobby, the same syllable wrapped around contempt and tied with a bow. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He gathered the documents, slid them back into the manila envelope, and stood. He lifted Rosie onto his hip with one arm, a motion he had performed every day since she was old enough to reach for him, smooth as breathing. "My grandfather worked 40 years in oil fields, so his family would never have to ask for respect," Caleb said quietly. No anger, only the low gravity of a truth that had cost a lifetime to earn. "I guess some things don't change." He walked out through the lobby. The employees fell into the particular silence that descends over a room when everyone knows something wrong has happened and no one is willing to name it. Margaret pretended to organize a drawer. Kevin examined his shoes as though they had suddenly become fascinating. Dana watched Caleb carry Rosie past her window and felt something tighten behind her sternum, pressure that had been building for 11 months and was now approaching the limit of what she could contain. Caleb reached the glass doors. His truck was in the lot, dented and reliable. There was a leaking water heater on Birch Street that still needed his attention before 5. He shifted Rosie to his other hip and reached for the door handle. The door opened inward before he could push it outward. A woman stepped through. Sharp black suit. Dark hair pulled back in a low knot. Identification lanyard visible beneath her collar. She carried herself with the particular authority of someone who did not need to announce her title for people to understand it. She stopped, looked at Caleb, looked at Rosie, looked back at Caleb. She did not step aside. She did not apologize for blocking his path. She simply stood there, reading the situation with eyes that missed nothing. From across the lobby, Preston Hargrove saw her, and the blood left his face in a single cold rush. Every branch manager in the Southeastern Division knew Sloan Beckett not by reputation alone, but by the specific dread that accompanied an unannounced visit from someone with the authority to end careers before lunch. Sloan extended her hand to Caleb first, not to Preston, who was now crossing the lobby with a smile that had appeared from nowhere like a magic trick performed badly. Not to Margaret or Kevin or any of the tellers frozen behind the counter. The handshake was firm and unhurried. Sloan Beckett, Regional Director, Southeastern Division. I'd like to understand what happened here today. Preston arrived at her side, slightly breathless, his voice shifting to a register Caleb had not heard before, higher, faster, eager in a way that bordered on desperate. Miss Beckett, what a pleasant surprise. Everything here is perfectly under control. This gentleman was just... Sloan raised one finger without looking at Preston. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it silenced him as completely as if she had turned off his volume. She kept her eyes on Caleb. Mr. Whitlock, would you mind stepping back inside with me for a few minutes? I'd like to review your file personally. Caleb studied her face. There was no condescension in it, no rehearsed smile, no performance, just focused, unhurried attention, the kind that costs nothing to give and is so rarely offered that when it appears, it feels almost startling. He looked down at Rosie, who was already staring at Sloane's shoes, black patent leather, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the lobby lights. Rosie's mouth formed a small O of admiration. Caleb nodded. In the consultation room, Sloan asked Preston to present the complete client file. Preston launched into his account, and with each sentence, the truth bent further from its original shape, like wire twisted until it no longer resembled what it had been. He described the documentation as incomplete. He described his own response as cautious, measured, fully in compliance with bank protocol. He described the delay as standard procedure that any responsible branch manager would implement for a transaction of this size. Sloan listened without interrupting, hands folded on the desk, her expression neutral, the way a calm sea is neutral, revealing nothing of what moves beneath. When Preston finished, she asked for the documents. She opened the envelope and read each page with the focused precision of someone who had reviewed thousands of estate files and could identify a legitimate transfer the way a jeweler identifies a real diamond quickly and without second-guessing. The notarization was current. The probate court order was valid and bore a judge's signature. The attorney's letter of instruction included a direct verification number. Every requirement had been met. She closed the envelope and looked at Preston. The neutrality was gone, replaced by something colder, more precise, infinitely more dangerous. The look of a person who has seen the full picture and is now deciding what to do about it. Mr. Hargrove, every document required for this transaction is present, properly executed, and in full compliance with federal banking regulations. She turned to Caleb. Her voice changed. Not warmer, exactly, but carrying a different weight, the weight of someone who understood that an apology, to mean anything at all, must be specific. Mr. Whitlock, I sincerely apologize for the delay and the experience you had today. This does not reflect the standards of this institution, and it should not have happened. Please allow me to handle your transaction personally." Rosie, still on Caleb's lap, looked up at Sloane with the unguarded directness only a 6-year-old possesses. "You have really nice shoes." The tension in the room cracked like thin ice under sunlight. Sloane looked down at Rosie, and for the first time that day she smiled with her whole face. Not the controlled professional expression she wore in quarterly reviews, but something involuntary and undefended, the kind of smile that arrives before a person can stop it. She crouched down to Rosie's level, something Preston had not done once during the entire interaction, and probably had never done for anyone under 4 feet tall. "Thank you, sweetheart, and I love your drawing. Who are the 2 people in the house?" Rosie pointed with her crayon. "That's Daddy, and that's me." Sloane nodded. The smile softened, but held. She straightened and gestured toward the hallway. "Mr. Whitlock, let's move upstairs to the private office. I'll process everything myself." The private office on the 2nd floor had a wider window and a view of the old oak trees lining Federal Street, their leaves turning amber and copper in the late October light. Sloane logged into the executive terminal, entered the authorization codes, and began processing the wire transfer. While the system verified routing numbers, the 2 of them talked. It was not the kind of conversation that typically occurs between a regional banking director and a walk-in customer. It happened because Sloane asked a question that had nothing to do with banking. "Tell me about your grandfather." Caleb leaned back and looked at the ceiling as though gathering the words from somewhere high and far. "Theodore Eugene Whitlock, born 1934, in a farmhouse outside Beaumont, Texas. He became a petroleum engineer, not because he loved oil, but because he loved the earth. 41 years mapping subsurface formations along the Gulf Coast. He survived 2 offshore rig fires, a Category 4 hurricane that flattened his neighborhood, and the death of his only daughter, my mother, Ellen, when I was 12. Ellen had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer. Theodore had spent her final 3 months sleeping in hospital chairs. After she died, he had raised Caleb himself, making the 4-hour round trip every weekend to attend school events and baseball games. He had never missed one. He lived in the same 1,200-square-foot house until the day he died, drove the same Ford pickup, wore the same steel-toed boots until the soles gave out, then had them resold rather than replaced. No one in Galveston knew Theodore Whitlock was wealthy, Caleb said. He didn't believe wealth was an interesting thing to know about a person. The will had contained one instruction beyond the financial allocation. 7 words, handwritten on the final page. "Take care of Rosie. The rest will take care of itself." Sloane listened without interrupting. Her hands rested on the keyboard but did not type. When Caleb finished, the room was quiet, except for the hum of the terminal and the traffic on Federal Street. After a moment, she spoke. "My father drove long-haul trucks out of Pittsburgh for 30 years. My mother worked the night shift at Allegheny General. I was the first person in my family to go to college." She paused. "Before every first day of school, every job interview, every time I walked into a room where I felt like I didn't belong, my father would say, 'You don't need money to have standards, Sloaney. Standards are free.'" Caleb looked at her across the desk. Something shifted between them, subtle, unnamed, like a room going from cold to warm without anyone touching the thermostat. "Sounds like my grandfather." The terminal chimed. Sloane turned to the screen and confirmed the wire transfer was complete. $8,200,000 had been routed to Caleb's primary account. But the system had flagged an additional item, a separate trust account established by Theodore Whitlock 3 years earlier under a different trustee designation, designated exclusively for the benefit of Rosemary June Whitlock. The trust balance was $1,200,000. Caleb had not known it existed. His grandfather's attorney had not mentioned it during the probate process. The trust operated independently and had only surfaced during the final reconciliation 2 weeks prior. He stared at the screen. His jaw tightened. His eyes went red at the rims. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and breathed in slowly through his mouth, the way a man breathes when he is trying to hold himself together in front of someone he has known for less than 2 hours. "He thought of everything," he whispered. Rosie sat on the carpeted floor behind Caleb's chair, drawing with quiet concentration. She did not look up. She did not know that her great-grandfather, a man she remembered only as the one who smelled like coffee and always had butterscotch candies in his shirt pocket, had set aside more than $1 million to make sure she would be safe and educated long after he was gone. Sloane gave Caleb a moment. She did not fill the silence with platitudes. She waited, the way a person does when they understand that grief does not follow a schedule. Then she rose and walked downstairs to find Preston. Sloane found Preston in the break room on the first floor, standing by the coffee machine with the studied casualness of a man who had been pacing for 40 minutes and was now pretending he had been calm. She closed the door. The latch clicking made him flinch. She told him she had reviewed the surveillance footage before entering the building. She had watched him approach a customer in the lobby and suggest, within earshot of multiple employees, that the man had confused millions with thousands. She had watched him whisper near the teller counter, describing a legitimate banking client as a potential fraud risk, based on no evidence other than appearance. She had reviewed every document and found them complete, current, fully compliant. There was no procedural justification for any delay. What had occurred today was not due diligence. It was discrimination. Preston attempted his defense. He described his actions as protective, an experienced manager exercising appropriate caution. He cited his 12 years in banking, his record of catching fraudulent claims. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed his justifications until they hardened into something he mistook for truth. Sloane let him finish. She always let people finish. Let them talk until they run out of rope, and they will tie the knot themselves. When he stopped, she spoke with measured clarity. You didn't protect the bank, Mr. Hargrove. You humiliated a grieving father in front of his 6-year-old daughter because he was wearing work boots and a denim jacket. That man lost his grandfather 6 months ago. He came here today to fulfill a dying wish, and you treated him like a criminal. She informed him he was suspended, effective immediately, pending a formal internal investigation. The investigation would examine the full pattern of complaints, 7 formal ones in the last quarter, and the outcome would likely include termination and a report to the Regional Compliance Board. Preston set down his coffee cup. His hand was not steady. He said nothing. There was a knock at the break room door. Dana Reeves stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her expression set with the resolve of someone who had been quiet too long and made a decision that could not be unmade. She wanted to file a formal statement. She described 3 previous incidents in which Preston had dismissed or denied service based on appearance. An elderly woman turned away with a valid cashier's check. A young couple driven out during a mortgage application. A veteran whose pension transfer had been deliberately delayed. Dana had dates, names, detailed descriptions written in a notebook she had kept in her desk drawer since her 3rd week, when she had first realized that what she was witnessing was not caution but cruelty. Sloane thanked her and asked her to submit the statement before end of business. Dana nodded once, looked briefly at Preston, left. Sloane picked up her bag and looked at Preston one final time. He was staring at the floor with the hollowed expression of a man watching his own reflection disappear. She walked out. Downstairs, Caleb sat in the lobby with Rosie asleep on his shoulder. Her crayon drawing rested on the chair beside him, the small house, the 2 figures, the sun, the flowers. He stared at it the way a man stares at something both perfectly simple and completely unbearable. He thought about Hannah, about the last Tuesday morning she had walked out the front door, calling over her shoulder that she would be back before dinner. A delivery truck had run a red light on Maple Avenue at 4:17. By the time he reached the emergency room, still in his work clothes, the doctors were already speaking in the past tense. He thought about Theodore, about the call at 5 in the morning, his grandfather's voice breaking for the first and only time Caleb had ever heard it break. Theodore had arrived 7 hours later, having driven straight through, his boots muddy, his face gray, but his hands steady. He had slept on Caleb's couch for 3 weeks, holding Rosie every night while Caleb sat in the garage with the lights off, learning that grief was not a wave but an ocean. Something you did not cross but lived inside. Theodore had never said it would be okay. He had simply shown up, morning after morning, until Caleb remembered how to stand. Sloane came down the stairs and crossed the lobby. She sat in the chair beside Caleb, careful not to disturb Rosie. For a long moment, Neither of them spoke. The afternoon light came through the tall lobby windows and laid itself across the marble floor in long, quiet shapes, the color of warm honey. "Your grandfather sounds like an extraordinary man," Sloane said softly. Caleb nodded, his hand resting gently on Rosie's back. He was. He just never needed anyone to know it. They sat there another minute. Two people in a bank lobby connected by something that had nothing to do with money. Sloane looked at the sleeping child on Caleb's shoulder and thought about the life she had built. The corner office, the regional title, the apartment in Charlotte where she ate dinner alone most nights, with a cat named Oliver as her only company. She thought about her ex-husband's words. "I feel like I'm married to a title, not a person." Sitting here now, watching a man in work boots hold his daughter as though she were more valuable than anything a bank could hold, Sloane felt something shift quietly in her chest. A small rearrangement of priorities she had kept in the wrong order for too long. Sloane asked Caleb what he planned to do with the inheritance. He did not answer immediately. He shifted Rosie gently on his shoulder and looked through the window at the parking lot, where his truck sat between two polished sedans like a draft horse standing among thoroughbreds. "Rosie's trust is already set up, so her future is covered. I need to fix the roof. It's been leaking since March, and I've been patching it with tarps and prayers." A small smile crossed his face, then faded. "And I want to set up a fund. Something small, something local. For single-parent families who need help with rent or repairs when things go sideways. There are a lot of people in this town who are one broken furnace or one car transmission away from a really bad month. I know because I've been in their kitchens fixing their pipes, and I've seen what they're dealing with." Sloane studied his face. 15 years in private banking, she had processed windfalls for clients who spent their first conversation talking about second homes, European vacations, offshore accounts. She had never not once heard someone describe $8 million without mentioning a single thing for themselves. "And nothing for you?" Caleb smiled. It was the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him all day, and it changed his entire face, softened the lines around his eyes, lifted the weight that seemed to live permanently in his jaw. "Maybe a new pair of boots?" Sloane reached into her bag and handed him a business card. Not the official branch card, her personal one, with her cell number. "If you need help setting up the community fund, or if you want guidance on the trust documents, call me directly, not the branch line. Mine." Caleb took the card, studied it for a moment, and slipped it into the pocket of his denim jacket. "Thank you, Miss Beckett." "Sloane," she corrected. He met her eyes. "Thank you, Sloane." Rosie stirred on his shoulder, opened one eye, saw Sloane, and gave a slow, sleepy wave, with fingers still faintly stained with crayon. Sloane waved back. Caleb stood, tucked the manila envelope under his arm, settled Rosie against his chest, and walked toward the door. Sloane watched them cross the lobby, a man in work boots carrying his daughter with one arm and a grandfather's legacy with the other, walking the same way he had walked in, without hurry, without show, without apology. She stood there a long time after the glass door closed. 1 week later, Caleb returned to Ridgemont Federal to sign the final paperwork for Rosie's trust. The atmosphere in the branch had shifted in ways both visible and invisible. Dana Reeves met him at the front door with a genuine smile and a paper cup of coffee from the cafe across the street. The lobby felt lighter, as though someone had opened a window that had been painted shut for years. Preston Hargrove's nameplate had been removed from the corner office. The door was closed. Caleb still wore flannel and boots. He had not bought new ones. Sloane handled the trust documents personally, walking Caleb through each clause with care. Then she introduced him to 2 wealth management advisors who spoke to him not as a windfall recipient, but as a client whose intentions they respected. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Sloane asked if Caleb had time for a cup of coffee. They walked across the street to a small place called Merriweather's Cafe, mismatched wooden chairs. A chalkboard menu the owner rewrote every morning in colored chalk. Rosie claimed a corner table and spread out her crayons like a painter setting up a studio. Caleb and Sloane sat by the window with 2 cups of black coffee, and they talked the way people talk when the professional scaffolding has been removed, and what remains is who they actually are. Sloane told him about her divorce 2 years earlier. Her husband, Paul, a high school English teacher, had been patient through the late nights, the canceled vacations, the weekends spent on conference calls. Eventually, he had sat her down and said, with more sadness than anger, that he felt like he was married to a job title rather than a person. She had not fought the divorce. She had not known how to argue with something that was true. Caleb listened. He did not offer advice or try to fix anything. He simply listened with his full attention, the way Theodore had taught him, not with the goal of responding, but with the goal of understanding. Theodore used to say that most problems in the world got smaller if you just let someone finish talking without rushing to fill the silence. Rosie finished her drawing and walked to the table holding it with both hands. She presented it to Sloane with the solemnity of a diplomat presenting a treaty. It was another house, triangular roof, flowers, Sunday. But this time, inside the house, there were 3 figures, one tall, one short, one in between. "This one has 3 people," Rosie announced. "The tall one is you." Sloane took the drawing carefully, holding it by the edges as though it were made of something that could shatter. Her hand trembled just barely, just enough for Caleb to notice. She looked at Rosie, then at Caleb, then at the 3 crayon figures standing together inside a house that did not exist yet but somehow already felt real. "Thank you, Rosie. I'll keep this forever." Caleb's phone buzzed on the table, a call from his grandfather's attorney in Houston. The attorney apologized during the final inventory of Theodore's safe deposit box at the Galveston Bank. They had discovered a sealed envelope tucked behind a stack of old mineral rights certificates. It was addressed to Caleb in Theodore's handwriting, and it had been overlooked during the initial probate. It was being sent by certified mail. It would arrive within 2 days. Caleb hung up and stared at the phone on the table. Rosie tugged his sleeve and asked if she could have a cookie. He ordered her 1 chocolate chip the size of her face. He did not mention the letter to Sloane. Some things from Theodore still belonged only to the 2 of them. 2 evenings later, after Rosie had brushed her teeth, read 2 pages of a picture book about a rabbit who wanted to be an astronaut, and fallen asleep clutching a stuffed animal named Pickles, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. The only light came from the fixture above the stove, casting a warm circle on the laminate countertop and the sealed envelope at its center. He opened it carefully. The paper inside was yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, each letter formed with the concentration of a man whose hands had once held drilling equipment steady in 100-mile-per-hour winds and now struggled to hold a pen. The letter began with the night Caleb was born. Theodore wrote that he had driven 4 hours through a thunderstorm to reach the hospital in Houston, that he had arrived with mud on his boots and rain soaking through his jacket, and that a nurse had tried to make him wait in the lobby until Ellen had shouted from the delivery room that if her father was not standing beside her in 30 seconds, she would get up and have the baby in the parking lot. Theodore wrote that he had held Caleb for the first time at 3:11 in the morning, and that the boy had wrapped his entire fist around Theodore's index finger and held on for 11 minutes without letting go. He wrote about Ellen, about the morning she had not woken up, when Caleb was 12, about driving to Houston that day and sitting on the porch of her house for an hour before he could bring himself to open the front door, about finding 12-year-old Caleb in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, trying to make scrambled eggs because he did not know what else to do, and realizing in that moment that grief was not something a person could carry alone, no matter how strong they believed themselves to be. The final paragraph was written in slightly steadier handwriting, as though Theodore had gathered every remaining ounce of steadiness in his body for the last lines. "You became the man I always hoped you'd be, not because of what you have, but because of how you love. Tell Rosie her great-grandpa is watching." Caleb pressed his palms flat against the kitchen table and breathed. Tears ran down his face silently, dropping onto the wood in small dark circles. He looked up at the wall above the stove. Hannah's photograph hung there, the one from their wedding, where she was laughing at something he had whispered during the vows, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her joy so complete it seemed to radiate beyond the frame. Beside it, a photograph of Theodore holding newborn Rosie in the hospital, grinning wider than Caleb had ever seen him grin, his weathered hands cradling her as gently as if she were made of light. And next to that, taped to the wall with a piece of Scotch tape already curling at the edges, Rosie's newest drawing. The house with 3 people inside. The next morning, Caleb's phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from Sloan, sent at 7:45. Would Rosie like to go to the zoo this Saturday? I have extra tickets. Absolutely no pressure. Caleb read it twice. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the photograph of Hannah on the wall. Then he typed, "She'd love that. So would I." He set the phone down, walked to the kitchen, and carefully placed Theodore's letter inside a simple wooden frame he had picked up from the hardware store the day before, between a box of pipe fittings and a roll of Teflon tape. He hung the frame on the wall beside the photographs and the drawing, then stepped back and looked at all of it together. Hannah laughing, Theodore holding Rosie, 3 crayon figures standing in a house full of flowers and sunlight. Saturday morning. The Ashboro Zoo, an hour and a half from Ridgemont, 52 degrees, pale sun through thin clouds, amber leaves falling in gusts off the wind. Caleb drove the truck. Rosie sat in the middle seat, counting the animals she hoped to see. Sloan sat in the passenger seat, wearing a wine-colored wool coat, a paper cup of tea warming her hand. They walked past the giraffe enclosure, past the lemurs, to the flamingo pond. Rosie ran to the glass and pressed her nose against it. Sloan stood beside Caleb, 1 step apart. The right amount of space. She likes you, Caleb said softly. I like her too. A silence. My grandfather's letter came last night, Caleb said. He wrote it before he died. Something only for me. Sloan did not ask what was in it. Did you read it? I read it. Hung it on the wall, next to my wife's picture and the one of him holding Rosie. Sloan nodded, said nothing. Understood. Caleb watched Rosie at the flamingo glass. There's a place I haven't been since my wife died, a place we used to go every October. Will you go? He looked at Sloan for a long moment. I think I'll go next year. October? She nodded. Did not ask whether he wanted company. He did not invite her. They both understood some moments did not need to be spoken aloud. On the drive home, Rosie slept in the middle seat with her head against Caleb's shoulder. Sloan looked out the window, the North Carolina road unspooling before them in the gold afternoon light of late October. Did you buy the new boots? She asked quietly. Caleb smiled. Not yet. These have a few more years in them. Theodore would be proud. He did not answer. He just loosened his grip on the steering wheel by 1 degree. When they reached Caleb's house in Ridgemont, Sloan got out to see them off. Rosie, sleepy, hugged Sloan before going inside the first time the child had reached for her on her own. Sloan bent down to receive her and held her for a moment against her shoulder. When Rosie let go and ran toward the door, Sloan straightened. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Caleb stood on the porch step. Are you free Wednesday? I'll have the roof finished next week. I'd like you to see what it looks like without the tarps. I'll come Wednesday. She turned, stopped, turned back. Caleb, yes. Your grandfather, he knew what you would do with the money. That's why he left it. He did not answer right away. I know. And he knew about Rosie. But he didn't know about the community fund. That's yours. I learned from him. You're the best part of him continuing. She got in the car. Caleb stood and watched the red taillights move down Federal Street and disappear. Inside the house, he stood before the wall, Hannah laughing, Theodore holding Rosie, the framed letter, the drawing of 3 people. Rosie ran to him and wrapped her arms around his leg. Daddy, is Sloan coming back? Caleb bent down and kissed the top of her head. Yes, sweetheart, she's coming back. Monday morning, he laced up the old boots, the ones still streaked with pipe sealant, picked up his toolbox, and drove to Birch Street, where a water heater had been leaking since Monday, and a family was waiting for hot water. $8 million had changed the numbers in his bank account. It had not changed the man who showed up.